All right, so are you ready to dive into Adam Grant's give and take with me today? We're going to really kind of flip the script on how we think about success.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Because we're not talking about, being cutthroat or anything like that. It's actually about the power of generosity.
Really interesting concept.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, you wouldn't think that being generous would be the key to getting ahead.
You would think it would be the opposite, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
being super aggressive.
Exactly.
But he really makes a compelling case.
He does, and he starts with this great story about this venture capitalist who offers like this amazing deal to this entrepreneur.
Okay.
And the entrepreneur says no.
Why?
That's what I said.
What?
Yeah, it's wild, right?
That's wild.
So that's kind of what we're going to unpack today is like, how can you be generous and still find success?
Yeah, because, obviously you don't want to be taken advantage of.
Right. You don't want to be a pushover.
Exactly.
But you also don't want to be, the person who's like, stepping on everyone's fingers to get to the top.
Right. You got to find that balance.
So how do we find that balance?
Well, he introduces these things called reciprocity styles.
Okay.
And there are 3 of them: givers, takers, and matchers.
Okay. So takers are like me first, right?
Me first. Exactly.
You are.
They want it to be equal.
Fair.
Like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine.
Okay. And givers are?
Givers are just people who are generally giving without expecting anything in return.
Okay. But givers can be successful too.
They can be very successful.
Okay.
But they have to be smart about it.
Okay. So how do they do that?
Well, let's take a look at Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Talk about a giver, right?
Yeah. He was known for his generosity.
Yes. But here's the thing. He filled his cabinet with rivals.
That's the Lincoln paradox.
Yes.
I love that part of the book because it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense.
Right, because if you're a giver, you would think that you'd want to surround yourself with people who are going to agree with you all the time and just like...
Yes, men.
Yes, men.
Exactly.
But he did the opposite. He did the opposite, and the reason he did that is because he understood that. By having different perspectives, even if they challenged his own views, it would make him a more effective leader.
It's like keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Right, exactly.
So it's like having those people around you who are going to kind of poke holes in your ideas.
Exactly.
You need that.
Can actually make you stronger.
Absolutely. And this kind of ties into this whole concept of lekking.
Lekking, okay.
Have you ever heard of that?
I have not.
Okay, so lekking is this thing in the animal kingdom where animals, often males, will compete for attention in a very showy way.
Interesting.
And so this relates to business and generosity because some people use giving as a way to kind of get ahead.
They're like showing off their generosity.
Exactly. It's like, look at me, I'm so generous.
Okay, so it's not always pure intentions.
So how can you tell if someone's a genuine giver versus someone who's just using giving to kind of
That is the question.
climb the ladder?
It's tough to say for sure, but there are some clues.
Like what?
Well, there's this really interesting study that analyzed photos of CEOs from tech companies,
Okay.
and they found that those CEOs who chose to have these large prominent photos of themselves in their annual report, they were more likely to be associated with taker behaviors later on.
Wow. So you could spot a taker just by looking at their photo.
Potentially.
Interesting.
And you remember Ken Lay from the whole Enron scandal?
Oh, yeah.
He's a classic example of someone who appeared to be very generous, but it was all a facade.
All for show.
Exactly.
So it's like we focus so much on what people say,
Right.
but sometimes it's how they present themselves that can tell us a lot more.
Absolutely. Nonverbal cues are huge.
So pay attention to those subtle signals.
Exactly.
So we've got these different reciprocity styles. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Like, how does someone who leans towards being a giver
Yeah,
actually network effectively?
that's a great question.
Because you would think,
Yeah.
you'd be the person who's like always saying yes to every favor.
Right. You're going to get burned out.
Yeah, you'd be completely overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
So how do you avoid that?
Well, this is where strategy comes in.
All right.
It's not about just saying yes to every request. It's about being strategic with your giving.
Okay.
And a great example of this is Adam Rifkin.
Okay.
Have you heard of him?
I have not.
Okay, so he is like a networking ninja.
Really?
I mean, this guy has more connections to like Fortune's most powerful people on LinkedIn than almost anyone.
Wow.
Like we're talking like the founders of Facebook, Twitter, like all the big names.
So how do you do that?
It's because he's constantly giving to his network.
Okay.
He's always willing to offer advice, make introductions, share his knowledge
Okay.
without expecting anything in return.
So it's genuine.
It's totally genuine.
Okay. But even then, that still sounds like a lot of work.
It is.
Like, how do you manage your time if you're constantly trying to help everyone?
Well, givers are also really good at recognizing other givers.
Okay.
And they focus on those relationships.
Okay, so they're not afraid to say no.
Exactly.
If someone's just constantly asking for things and not giving anything back.
Exactly. They're not afraid to cut those ties.
That makes sense.
And another key thing that givers do is they focus on dormant ties.
Dormant ties. What's a dormant tie?
Okay, so these are those connections that we all have, where it's like you haven't talked to someone in a while.
Right, like an old colleague or something?
Exactly. And you might think, oh, it'd be weird to reach out now.
Yeah.
But because givers have that history of being helpful,
Yeah.
people are usually really excited to hear from them.
That's true.
So it's a great way to rekindle connections.
Okay, so you're saying don't be afraid to reach out to those people you haven't talked to in a while.
Exactly.
Because you never know what could come of it.
You never know.
Okay, so we've talked about networking.
Right.
What about teamwork?
Yes.
Do givers make good teammates?
Givers are amazing teammates
Why is that?
because they're more likely to put the team's success ahead of their own.
Okay.
And a great example of this is George Meyer,
Okay.
one of the lead writers for The Simpsons.
Okay, I love The Simpsons.
Me too. And he was known for rarely taking credit for his work,
Really?
even though he was a brilliant writer.
She just wanted to be in the background.
He just loved the collaborative process,
Wow.
and he understood that his greatest strength was actually rewriting and polishing other people's work.
Interesting.
So he was happy to contribute behind the scenes.
Okay, but is it possible to be too selfless?
Yes, and that's where it can backfire.
Okay.
And a classic example of this is Jonas Salk,
No.
who developed the polio vaccine.
Huge discovery.
Huge, right. But he made a critical mistake.
What was that?
He took sole credit for the discovery
I know, right?
at the press conference. At the press conference, he's like, I did it.
Oh, me.
When in reality, he had a whole team,
Oh, wow.
and they were not happy.
I bet.
Yeah, and it actually really hurt his career in the long run
Really?
because he didn't acknowledge their contributions.
So even when you're a genius, you still need to be a team player
You absolutely do.
and acknowledge the people around you.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It all comes back to perspective taking,
What's that?
which givers are generally pretty good at.
Okay.
It's that ability to step outside of your own experience
Okay.
and try to understand how other people are feeling and thinking.
Put yourself in their shoes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And studies show that we start to develop this ability to take other people's perspectives from a really young age.
Really?
There's this fascinating study where they gave toddlers a choice between goldfish crackers and broccoli.
Okay.
Most of them wanted the crackers.
Oh, yeah.
Who wouldn't?
Right.
But then the researchers pretended to love broccoli and hate crackers.
Okay.
And then they asked the toddlers for food. Interesting.
And the older toddlers, the ones who had developed more advanced perspective-taking skills, they offered the researchers broccoli,
Right.
even though they wanted the crackers themselves.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is incredible.
So even toddlers can kind of understand that concept
Right. It's amazing.
of thinking about what someone else might want.
Exactly.
So we talked about George Meyer, The Simpsons, being a great team player.
Yes.
What about the flip side of that?
Yeah.
What about when people try to go solo,
Right?
even if they are really talented?
It often backfires.
Does it?
Yeah, the lone genius myth is often just that, a myth.
Okay.
We actually achieve far more when we work together.
Interesting.
And a great example of this is Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh, wow, the architect.
Yes, the iconic architect. Right. But he was also convinced that he could achieve even greater success if he worked independently.
Oh, really?
So he left his established team in Chicago, and he moved to this remote part of Wisconsin,
Okay.
basically isolated himself to pursue his own vision.
Exactly. But it backfired. His individual productivity actually suffered.
Wow.
His relationships with his apprentices became strained, and many of them actually ended up leaving.
Wow. So even for someone like Frank Lloyd Wright,
I know, it's surprising, right?
collaboration was key.
It was essential for his success.
Interesting. Okay, so it seems like that's a recurring theme here.
It is.
That we're stronger together.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And this ties into another strength of givers,
Which
is
is?
their ability to spot potential in others.
Okay.
So it's not just about recognizing talent, it's about seeing the possibilities in people
Okay.
that they might not even see in themselves.
So how do they do that?
Well, a great example is C.J. Skender.
Okay.
He teaches accounting
Accounting.
at Duke and UNC.
Okay.
But here's the thing. He's won tons of teaching awards.
For accounting?
Yes.
Really?
His students rave about how engaging and interesting he makes the subject.
How do you make accounting interesting?
Right. It's amazing.
Incredible.
And his secret is that he's passionate about cultivating interest in his students.
Okay.
He believes that interest comes before talent,
Interesting.
meaning that if you can get someone excited about something,
Yeah.
they're far more likely to excel in it.
It's like finding that spark,
Exactly.
that passion.
And he uses humor, he tells stories, he even relates accounting concepts to music,
Wow.
anything to help his students connect with the material.
That's great.
Yeah, he's amazing.
So it's not just about teaching the subject.
No.
It's about creating that environment
Exactly.
where people feel excited to learn.
Yes.
That's incredible. And you know what this reminds me of? There's this study called the Pygmalion effect.
Oh, yes.
Have you heard of this one?
I have.
Where they told these teachers that certain students were like
Yeah.
high potential students.
Right.
And they were just randomly selected.
Right. They're no different from the other students.
And those students ended up performing better.
Because the teachers treated them differently.
Exactly.
It gave them more attention, more encouragement.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
So just that belief
It's powerful, right?
that someone has potential can actually help them reach their potential.
Absolutely. Our beliefs about others really matter,
They do.
especially if we're in a position of authority.
It's like that saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of potential,
Yes.
sometimes the initial investment we make in someone,
Yeah.
whether it's a colleague or a personal relationship, it just doesn't work out the way we hoped.
That's true.
And this is where givers really set themselves apart,
How so?
because they're more willing to cut their losses and move on.
Really?
They're not afraid to say, you know what, this isn't working.
Even if they've invested a lot.
Yeah, even if they've invested a lot of time and energy.
Wow.
And a great example of this is Stu Inman.
Okay.
He was the former general manager of the Portland Trail Blazers.
Okay, basketball.
Basketball, exactly.
Okay.
And he was known for having a real talent for spotting undervalued players.
Yeah?
But he was also famous for being willing to trade players
Oh.
who weren't living up to their potential.
Even if they were like high draft picks or something.
Even if they were. Yeah,
Wow, that's tough.
it is tough.
Especially in that world
Absolutely.
where there's so much pressure to win.
Yes.
But sometimes you have to
You have to know when to move on.
cut your losses.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about networking, teamwork, spotting potential.
Right.
What about communication?
Yes.
Do givers have to be really assertive to get their ideas across?
That's a great question.
Because, you think about a giver and you think about someone who's always putting others first.
Right.
Maybe they're not speaking up for themselves.
That's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But actually, givers often adopt what's called a powerless communication style.
Powerless.
I know it sounds counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but it can be really effective.
Oh.
Well, they're more likely to ask questions,
Okay.
listen attentively,
Okay.
even express vulnerability.
So it's not about being like the loudest voice in the room.
No, not at all.
It's about creating that space
Exactly.
for dialogue
Exactly.
and understanding.
And when we do that, we build trust
Okay.
and rapport.
Which can actually be very persuasive.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
And a great example of this is Dave Wharton.
Okay.
He's a really successful trial lawyer
Okay.
who happens to have a stutter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That must be incredibly challenging.
It was something he struggled with for a long time,
Yeah.
but he eventually discovered that it actually made him more relatable to the jury
Really?
because it humanized him.
Huh. Interesting.
So it made people more likely to trust him.
He turned it into a strength.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
So it really highlights the power of vulnerability
Yeah.
when we're willing to be open and authentic,
Yeah.
even about our perceived flaws.
Mhm.
It can actually make us more persuasive.
So we've seen how giving can lead to success. But let's be honest. There's got to be a downside, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a risk of burnout, right?
Exactly. You're constantly putting others first. You might end up feeling drained or even taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And that's why Grant makes this really important distinction between selfless givers and other-ish givers.
Okay, selfless versus other-ish. What's the difference?
So selfless givers are the ones who are constantly putting everyone else's needs ahead of their own.
Okay.
And while that might sound admirable, it can actually be really unsustainable in the long run.
So they end up burning out.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
give and they give until they have nothing left.
And then what happens?
Well, they might become resentful. They might start to feel like their own needs don't matter.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they might even withdraw from giving altogether.
Which kind of defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly.
So how do you avoid that trap?
That's where other-ish giving comes in.
Okay, so tell me more about other-ish giving.
So other-ish givers understand that they need to take care of themselves in order to take care of others.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about finding that balance between giving and receiving.
Okay, so how do otherish givers actually manage their time and
Mm.
energy?
Well, one really effective strategy is chunking.
Chunking. What's that?
So instead of trying to sprinkle little bits of generosity throughout their week, otherish givers will actually block out specific time for giving.
Okay.
So maybe it's a couple of hours every week where they volunteer at a local charity, or maybe it's setting aside time each day to mentor a colleague.
So they're intentional about it.
Exactly. They make it a priority.
And that helps prevent burnout.
Exactly, because they're not constantly feeling pulled in a million different directions.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And another thing that other shiggers do really well is they build a strong support network of their own.
Okay.
They recognize that they can't do it all alone.
Makes sense.
So they surround themselves with other givers and matchers, people who believe in reciprocity.
So it's like a two-way street.
Exactly. It's about creating a community of support.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of avoiding burnout and building support. But what about this fear that givers might get overlooked professionally?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a common concern, right?
Yeah, because they're so busy helping everyone else. They might not be as assertive about asking for what they deserve.
It's the whole nice guys finish last stereotype.
Exactly.
But the good news is that givers don't have to become ruthless to get ahead.
Okay, so how can they advocate for themselves without sacrificing their values?
Well, one effective strategy is to frame their requests in a way that highlights how others will benefit.
Okay, so it's not just about what's in it for them.
Right. It's about connecting their personal goals to a larger purpose.
So, for example,
So instead of just asking for a raise because they feel like they deserve it, a giver might say, you know, if I got a raise, it would allow me to donate more to this charity that I'm really passionate about.
wow, that's really smart
It is, right?
because it appeals to people's better nature.
Exactly. It taps into that desire to make a difference.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the power of giving on an individual level, but can we zoom out for a second and talk about the bigger picture? Like, is it really possible to create a more giving world?
You know, it's a big question, right?
It is.
But Grant actually believes that it is possible.
Okay, how so?
He talks about this idea of the Scrooge shift.
The Scrooge shift.
Yeah, have you heard of this?
I haven't. Tell me more.
Okay, so it's this idea that even people with strong taker tendencies can become more generous if the environment encourages it.
So it's about changing the system.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of giving.
And how do you do that?
Well, Grant uses the example of Craigslist versus Free Cycle.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, so Craigslist is all about buying and selling, right?
Yeah, it's very transactional.
Exactly. Whereas Free Cycle is all about giving things away for free.
Totally different vibe.
Totally. And so Grant argues that by creating systems that reward generosity, we can actually encourage more people to become givers.
Interesting. So it's not about trying to change people's personalities.
Right.
It's about changing the environment
Exactly.
to make it more conducive to giving.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Right.
Okay, so one last question. Does true selflessness actually exist?
The age-old debate.
Right.
Well, Grant explores both sides of the argument, and the truth is there's evidence to support both.
Okay.
So on the one hand, you have these amazing stories of people who risk their lives to save strangers.
Which seems like pure altruism, right?
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that.
Right. But then there's also research that suggests that even our most selfless acts might be motivated by a desire to feel good about ourselves.
So it's complicated.
It's really complicated.
Yeah.
And I think recognizing that complexity is important
Okay.
because it allows us to be more intentional about our giving.
So it's not always black and white.
Exactly.
I
It's a
see that.
spectrum. That makes a lot of sense. Well, this has been such a fascinating dive into give and take. It really has me rethinking my whole approach to success.
Me too. It's a powerful book.
It really is. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that giving is not about being a pushover. It's about being strategic and intentional with your generosity.
Absolutely. When we give strategically, we can actually create a ripple effect of positive change.
I love that. And here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. If we tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to ourselves, could becoming more conscious givers be a way to break out of those echo chambers and connect with people who are different from us,
Ooh, that's a good one.
expanding our networks and our perspectives in the process?
I love that idea. It's about challenging ourselves to be more open and more generous in all aspects of our lives.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into give and take. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, be sure to tune in next time for another deep dive.